In last week's video, I discussed in detail the beginnings of the critical response to the American splatter movement by analyzing the reception to the release of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake in 2003, directed by Marcus Nispel. I discussed how these critiques were informed by decades of critical dismissal of horror films and given by critics who don't understand horror films. In this week's video, we'll explore the prequel to the remake and showcase how the budding movement would shape the film's artistic choices and how those critiques would become cemented. The remake isn't necessarily classified amongst the American splatter film subgenre. However, it incorporated much more gore than the original and would serve in some way as a precursor to the subgenre. As I pointed out in the New York Times review of the film, the idea that bleak depictions of extreme violence would be what audiences demand out of their mainstream horror films was not an idea accepted by critics. 3 years later, however, with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre The Beginning's release, this was already a well-established and much-acknowledged industry trend. Marcus Nispel would not return to direct the film, meaning Platinum Dunes would move towards another young director, continuing the company's philosophy. They would hire Jonathan Liebesman, who had been coming off a disastrous experience directing Darkness Falls and who was considering leaving the industry, though he had directed the short film Rings, which served as a tie-in short film that bridged the gap between The Ring and The Ring 2. Michael Bay and the producers behind the film wanted to give him another chance, one that could showcase a healthier working environment, and one that would encourage him to continue to pursue a directing career. Liebesman spoke in featurettes about his love of blood and his insistence on more and more of it to drench the screen with gory scenes of chainsaw mayhem. This would help him to fit right into the modern era of horror films and would push the series further into a new direction. The film displays inspiration taken from Hostel and other extreme horror films of the era. The film would continue the company philosophy of pursuing large profit margins by shooting the film on a modest budget. The film was made on a reported budget of $16 million, a larger budget than the previous film. It would have to be a prequel due to the way that the previous film ended, which is always a tightrope to walk with a horror film. The story would be constructed by Sheldon Turner and David J. Show, with Turner writing the screenplay. Lucas Etlin was brought in as director of photography. Jonathan Chibnall, Jim May, and Joel Negron would be co-editors. Marco Rubeo would be the production designer, with art direction done by John Frick, and Greg Nicotero as special makeup supervisor. The production would utilize a number of the same locations as the previous film, which meant again shooting on location in the Texas heat. The film would be the third release for Platinum Dunes after both the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Amityville Horror remakes proved to be massive successes. The studio's business model was proving to be a success, and they would be returning to the well to continue their winning streak. The film was released on October 6, 2006, and was met with predictably poor negative critical reception, but also unsurprisingly, the film made back its budget with a box office showing of over $51 million worldwide. While not as sexy of a number as the other two films for Platinum Dunes, which both made over $100 million worldwide, it still would generate a profit. Nathan Lee in the New York Times panned the film, stating, quote, "There's more to come, no doubt, given the bloodlust for torture and indifference to depravity characteristic of contemporary horror films. Every era gets the scare pictures it deserves, and there is nothing more unsettling in this orgy of hate than its overwhelming stench of corporate nihilism." End quote. This review showcases just how strongly the new wave of horror films had started to dominate the genre. The critiques are also a strong sign of the types of cliché criticisms that the movement's films would attract. Lee believes that this is a cynical movie to cash in on an emerging trend in horror. So with that context being laid out, do I agree with him? What do I think of the film? Well, let's look a little closer. Let's explore the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Beginning. The film tries to answer so many questions that no one cared to ask about the original. No one cares why Monty doesn't have his legs anymore, or why Sheriff Hoyt doesn't have his teeth. An interesting question that the film does attempt to explore, however, is how the family degraded morally into what we see in the previous film, though it never really gives a satisfying answer. The film doesn't work very well in prequel mode, with the storyline more generally struggling to keep me captivated. We already know that no one will make it out of there alive, so the struggles lose a strong sense of tension. That being said, the film makes some interesting stylistic changes that help it to stand out in comparison with the previous film. The more chaotic documentary filming style, the low camera angles, and the heavier reliance on shaky cam accentuate a grittier feel. In my previous video, I critiqued the remake's at times preference for showing off stylistically rather than sticking to the visceral horror. Don't get me wrong, I love horror films that have style as the substance, such as with the work of Dario Argento, but the remake was asking us to invest in these characters, so the constant stylistic touches hurt the film's tension. The film does a better job of keeping us immersed in the horror, though we still get some beautiful production design and special effects. The bloody kills in this film are brutally beautiful, though at times they can feel like overkill or like too much fan service, especially with the over-reliance on the chainsaw. Matt Bomer's death is the film's most impactful and truly helps the film to match some of the other films coming out at the time. There was a true sense of rivalry amongst these filmmakers as to who could make the most brutal and over-the-top kill scenes, and this one does its job in that respect. Jordana Brewster gives a solid performance, with her character serving as an interesting audience surrogate. She repeatedly goes back to save other characters, bringing us further into the madness. Her resourcefulness is fun to watch, and she puts up a great fight. It's too bad she had to die, as her death scene is really stupid and anticlimactic. It feels like a tacky ending forced on because they knew she couldn't survive for the narrative of the other film to make any sense. The film perhaps has too much R. Lee Ermey, giving us more backstory on his character than anyone could have wanted. Prequels or origin stories in horror can work when done well, but this one feels so unnecessary and kills some tension in its insistence on tying everything together. I get they wanted to answer fan questions, but they went overboard in a way that hampered the film's ability to be an effective horror film. I think it's clear that the film was inspired by genre trends at the time, but also was made by talented professionals who truly wanted to make a fun horror movie for the fans. The effects are awesome, and the kills, while hit or miss at times, can be great. The performances are pretty solid across the board, though the writing isn't amazing. Liebsman does a decent job directing and showcasing a clear vision for the type of horror film he wanted to create. He would move on to action sci-fi films for the rest of his career, at least up to this point, but I would be interested to see him move back to the genre at some point. The film isn't a great prequel, but at times it can be a pretty good standalone film. I love immersing myself in this brutal and bleak world. It fits very well within the larger American splatter film boom, and I think within this context, it stands out as a unique way of approaching franchise expansion through the lens of a new artistic movement. It certainly does better than Halloween H2O's attempt at emulating the style of Scream. Due to the relatively modest success of the film, there wouldn't be a continuation of this timeline in the series, which is probably for the best. There wasn't any new areas to explore with these characters, so it came to a fitting end at the hands of a madman wielding a chainsaw.